everyone, and welcome to the Hadassah magazine discussion. The magazine discussion enables us to delve a little deeper into content published in the magazine. In this case, our special issue examining Israel through a multitude of lenses as we celebrate her 75th birthday. And indeed, that's what we intend to do today with a stellar panel of Israeli guests who can give us insight and perspective as we simultaneously marvel at the amazing nation that Israel has become and worry about its future. So now to introduce our guests. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Isabel Kershner is a correspondent for the New York Times in Jerusalem, covering both Israeli and Palestinian politics and society. Her latest book, The Land of Hope and Fear, Israel's Battle for Its Inner Soul, was just released this week. Maybe your first appearance. I presume we are. Hen Mazzig is an award-winning Israeli author, writer, speaker, and digital influencer. His first best-selling book, The Wrong Kind of Jew, a Mizrahi Manifesto, was published last year, and he has written for a host of other publications. So I really want to start on a positive note with a question for all of you. What exactly are we celebrating as Israel marks its 75th birthday? Yossi, let's start with you.
So first of all, hi, everyone. And Mazal Tov to Isabel and Hen on your new books. Delighted to be with you all. Lisa, when I think of the first word that comes to mind for me of what Israel means to me, it's not love. And it's not pride, it's gratitude. And gratitude for saving the Jewish people, for restoring us from the lowest point in our history, which I think was 1945, to what I regard as the peak moment in Jewish history, which despite all the problems that we're dealing with, is today. And Israel has created the world's largest, strongest, most heterogeneous Jewish community in the world, in history, for that matter. And it has taught the Jewish people how to defend itself again. And it has recreated us out of disparate communities back into an organic people. And thinking about I know we're supposed to stay positive, and I am going to stay positive, even though I'm going to be bringing up for a moment that this difficult time. When I think about what we're going through in Israel now, and I've been very involved in the demonstrations for democracy, most of all, I feel grateful to be part of a generation of Jews that's alive at a time when we can grapple with the very difficult consequences of Jewish sovereignty. So for all those reasons, this is for me a moment to unequivocally celebrate.
Thank you. Isabel, what do you think?
Hi to all the panelists and you, Lisa, and thank you for having me. I agree with Yossi. There's a remarkable arc here of history and where Israel has gotten to today. I think through my travels on working on this book, what came through for me was just the incredible passion and engagement and sense of belonging of all the people here, no matter from what side and no matter, how deep the divisions. Everybody wanted to be here. Everybody sees the future here. They're just fighting over what that should look like. And I think one of the wonderful expressions of Israel today that I would like to celebrate is, obviously there's the wonderful high tech and 10 million people, but I would like to just give a shout out to the Hebrew language and culture that has grown up here. It's so vibrant. And I just want to share with you all, I was a few nights ago at the opera in Tel Aviv. It was rather surreal. It was like the day after the last Gaza war ended, and everybody's sitting in this plush opera house watching an original Israeli opera called Theodore, about Theodore Herzl, the visionary of the Jewish state. warts and all portrayal. And packed house watching this opera in original Hebrew libretto of a very flawed guy with these crazy ideas. And you're thinking to yourself, you're only actually here watching this because of him. And the engagement of the audience, the reaction of the audience, the way the audience connected and burst into applause in the middle of certain parts of the libretto just because they so identified with what was being said. It was a moment that could only happen here.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. Hen, what do you think?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. And Isabel and Yossi, two giants. Yossi wrote a blurb for my book, and I'm still in disbelief that someone that I admired so much, would do that for me. So thank you, Yossi.
It's my honor.
Thank you so much. And I think that for me, I think what we're celebrating more than anything is that Jews finally have a place where we have our own homeland. We have a sanctuary for when people try to murder us, as they did to my grandparents, which I write at length about in my book. And no matter how isolated or misunderstood I feel for being Israeli, for being judged because of my nationality or being Jewish, I feel like supporting Israel is thousands times better than living in a world without a country to run to. And I think that the world is much safer for Jews since the creation of Israel. I think we can all agree on that. And if anyone tells you otherwise, I have pictures of my grandparents, and you can show it to them and say that just because of Israel, my grandparents are alive, and because of them, I am alive today.
Yeah. Nice, all three of you. Since its inception, there were two seemingly contradictory notions of what the modern state of Israel would and should become: a state like any other state, or a light unto the nations. Clearly, Israel has become both, right? But can you give examples of how Israel has been a light unto the nations and whether the nations actually see it that way? Hen, let's start with you this time.
Well, I think that being a light to the nations for me means continuously trying to be better and improve ourselves. It doesn't mean being perfect. Things don't have to be perfect for us to love them and to celebrate them, and to risk our life fighting for them, be it in the army or here in London. That I often have to risk my life defending Israel. But I truly think that Israel is a work in progress, and that it's a place where there's so many different challenges that we have to overcome, and it's in the name of Israel is to fight with itself, with internal inside, having an internal struggle. And I do, while I really a lot of times I'm disappointed and I'm frustrated, and it's there's so much work to be done, and I very publicly have strong opinions about, and I'm very critical of some of the policies of the government. I still love seeing how human it is, and how we are. When there is an issue, we're solving it with going out with Israeli flags to the streets, and the protests are not as violent as I see them around the world when there's internal conflicts on social issues and in different countries. It just feels different to me. So I think that in itself is just the way that we face our challenges is a beautiful way to show the world this is the light upon the nations in my eyes.
Yeah. Yossi, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that just to pick up on what Hen was saying, the democratic movement that's erupted in astonishing dimensions in the last 6 months. We've never seen anything like this in Israeli history of a sustained protest movement reaching all parts of Israeli society. There are settlers in Efrat who join in the weekly demonstrations. This is not by any means only a liberal secular phenomenon, and it's there's no example that I can think of a country that was in danger of losing its democracy, as I believe we are today, for example, looking at Hungary, looking at Poland, looking at Turkey, where you have this sustained and passionate outpouring of love and concern for the country, for the country's identity. And Hen made a very important point about the symbol of these protests. It's the Israeli flag. And what I feel when I'm in these demonstrations is an eruption of patriotism. This is not a far left demonstration. This is not an expression of alienation from the Zionist ethos. Quite the opposite. What the demonstrators are saying is to the government is, you are violating the Zionist ethos. We are defending Zionism. And if you think about the situation in America, I think one of the tragedies for American political discourse is that the flag has been appropriated by only one side. And in Israel, the flag still belongs to all parts of the political spectrum. And so one has to be very careful about drawing analogies between Israeli society and American society. We are still a society that's deeply in love with our story, with our ethos. And what's playing out now in Israel, in a way, is a kind of an excess of Israeli concern for the country. And the reason that I say excess is because our problem, unlike in other societies in the West, our problem is that everyone feels proprietous, personally responsible for the fate of the country. And that can create tremendous discord, because what we have is a clash of passionate commitment to Israel coming from all sides of the political spectrum, all sides of the cultural spectrum. And that results in a great deal of conflict, but it is not a conflict that comes from apathy, quite the opposite.
Mm. Isabel, do you want to add to that?
Well, I first of all totally agree with Hen and Yossi, the power of these demonstrations. And you can be outside the Knesset and the Supreme Court with 200,000 people and nobody will step on a flower bed, you know. Every flower will survive. It's remarkable. But I think, you know, not wanting to interject too much of a flip side, but I'm not sure today Israel is seen by much of the world as a light unto the nations, to be honest. And of course, we have the unresolved conflict with the Palestinians. We have work to do still in the Arab world. And I think, you know, yes, there's a sense of Israel being a triumph over adversity. It's incredible what has been achieved. You now have fine wines being made in the Negev desert, incredible innovation, which, you know, many Israelis are taking out into the world and using to help other communities, whether it's in Africa or Asia. And there is that. But Israel is now a very strong country. It's a prosperous country. It's a mighty country militarily. And yet still is so troubled by its own conflicts, which are unresolved. And I think we can't just brush that under the carpet, however much we want to celebrate 75 years.
Yeah, could I add something, Lisa?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I really appreciate Isabel's injection of a dose of realism, because that really reflects the mood in Israel today. I wouldn't say the mood is unequivocally celebratory by any means, and so it's important to look at the shadow along with the light. At the same time, I think that what we're experiencing now is really a reflection of a society that is belatedly confronting very deep questions of its identity, which we've always deferred. We talk about ourselves as a Jewish state and a democratic state, and we haven't really asked ourselves the hard questions. What do we mean by a Jewish state? What do we mean by a democratic state? What's playing out in Israel at the moment is a very deep debate over what we mean by democracy. Is democracy the simple rule of the majority? Does the majority take all? That's the government's position. We won, you lost. We have the right to do anything, including passing anti-democratic legislation, including dismantling or threatening some crucial democratic institutions. The alternative understanding of democracy is liberal democracy. And by liberal, I don't mean left. Liberal in Israel means something different. You can be right-wing and still be liberal. Menachem Begin was a liberal nationalist who defended the independence of the court no less passionately than the Labour Party, than the Israeli left. In fact, in some ways, I think Begin was an even greater champion of the independence of the court. And so the liberal understanding of democracy is that democracy is a delicate dance between the rights of the majority and the rights of the minority. And that's what's being fought over now on the streets. I think there's another issue here, which hasn't come out as explicitly, but I think it's coming. And that is, what do we mean by Jewish state? My understanding of the classical Zionist idea of a Jewish state is the state of the Jewish people. Whatever that means, whoever the Jews are, the whole unruly mess, that's the Jewish people. And this government has a much more narrow definition of a Jewish state, which is the state of Judaism, in particular, the state of Orthodox Judaism. And we're seeing that with the legislation, the religious legislation that this government is promoting. We're seeing it with the what I believe is the next great threat and the next great divide in Israeli society, which will be over the law of return. Do we preserve the expansive definition of the law of return that allows anyone with a single Jewish grandparent to join Israeli society? Or do we begin whittling away at that expansiveness, which I believe is what this government is going to do? So in that sense, what we're playing out now is a very painful but necessary self-confrontation.
Mm. You know, Daniel Gordis has a new book out as well, The Impossible Takes Longer, where he, I think, maybe has kind of revived this notion that, you know, in academic circles has been there, but not necessarily in the popular, about an ethnic democracy, that it really was never intended to be, kind of, Yossi, as you said, you know, exactly like a liberal democracy, because it was meant to protect and fend for Jewish rights and Jewish people in a different way. So that complication seems like it's always been there to some extent. And do you really think that now that ultimately is really going to be one of the big challenges to kind of get around the juggling that Israel has done for all these years?
You know, I think the amazing balancing act that the founders tried to impart to Israeli society was, on the one hand, to embrace this idea of an ethnic democracy. Israel is the project of the Jewish people. Israel is created and exists to deal primarily with the problems of a deeply abnormal people. A people that desperately needed a solution to its abnormal problems, and on the other hand, to promise a liberal democracy. And so it wasn't just creating an ethnic democracy. If you read the Declaration of Independence, my understanding of what the framers, the founders, intended was that Israel, on the one hand, is the state of all Jews, whether or not you are actually a citizen of Israel. And it will be the state of all of its citizens, whether or not you are Jewish. Now, that's a very difficult balancing act to hold. And then when you factor in the problems that we're facing, relentless security threats, from day one of our existence, we've never known a real day of peace. A 50-plus year occupation of another people from which we can't extricate ourselves safely. Very few Israelis believe that if we were to withdraw tomorrow from the West Bank, we would have peace. More likely, we would have another Gaza, but this one on our most sensitive border. And so we have these objective constraints on our democracy. But for me, the greatness of Israeli democracy is not that we are a paragon of democratic norms. We can't be. A country that is struggling with the issues that we're dealing with can't possibly be a paragon of objective democracy. But what I believe we are a paragon of is of a society that is, under impossible circumstances, struggling to maintain basic democratic norms, basic decency. That, for me, is why the Israeli democratic experiment is so precious to the world. We are the laboratory for what happens to democracy under conditions of extremity. What happens when democracy is relentlessly pressured by security threats, by one wave after another of destitute refugees coming from countries with no democratic traditions into the Israeli pressure cooker. This is an extraordinary democratic story, but it is not a perfect democratic story because it can't be. So let's acknowledge what it isn't, and let's own and celebrate what it is.
I want to get a little deeper into kind of representation and who is really out there on the streets. Can you in your book, you really talk so importantly about the Mizrahi population. Now, obviously, the Mizrahi community is no more monolithic than any other community. But to what extent can you tell us are Mizrahim represented out there, and what is it that they're fighting for at this point?
Mizrahim. If Mizrahim represented in the street of Israel, of course they are the majority of Jews in Israel today. First, second, third generation Mizrahi Jews that are descendants of Jews from the Middle East, that came from the Middle East and North Africa. If you look at the pop culture in Israel, if you look at the cuisine, when we speak about Israeli cuisine, we're speaking about Mizrahi cuisine that is also under assault in the West, because people say that we actually stole it, which is laughable because, of course, it was the only thing that my grandparents came to Israel with. They couldn't even carry suitcases back with them, but they had their recipes and their stories, and even that is being coming under attack today. But if we are represented in the government, we never had a prime minister that was Mizrahi. The Mizrahi issue is coming up often, both by the left-wing parties in Israel and the right-wing parties in Israel. None of them actually focusing on, or there's a few that actually trying to focus on solving the gap, because according to Advar report from last year, there's still a 30% wage gap between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, and that includes the Ashkenazi Haredim. So that's even making it even more interesting and something that we need to solve. In terms of academia, although there was no research that has been done in recent years that shows of this difference, the last one was from 2015 that shows that only 5% of Israeli academic staff were Mizrahim. There was never a head of any university of Israel that was Mizrahi. You never had a head of Olympic championship that was Mizrahi, the Olympic Championship Committee that was Mizrahi. You never had head of a theater, of the national theaters, that was Mizrahi. All of this coming to say that, it's statistically, and I really don't like to speak about statistics, but in this case, I think it's very telling on how we've been deprived from places of power in the Israeli society. In a sense, it's not systemic racism because it's not systemic in there are no laws that really discriminate us, but the continuous way that we are being ignored, and that our issue is only being politicized and used as a political football from right wing to left wing to say who cares about Mizrahi more. And even the Mizrahi representation that we are seeing in the government is being elected. If it's being elected by the right wing, it says Mizrahi Jews would vote them as a way to get back at those that have been racist to them in the street by electing the stereotypes of Mizrahim and those politicians like Miri Regev and Dudi Amsalem, other MKs that are very loud, and you see and using very vulgar language often. It's almost as if they're playing to their voters because they know that this is what their voters want. And on the other side, on the left, we are seeing Mizrahi Jews that are not really committed to the Mizrahi struggle. And if they are committed to the Mizrahi struggle, it doesn't come from a Zionist point of view. I think that we have been, Mizrahi Jews have been left with no true representation that wants to help bridge the gap between our communities and help Mizrahi Jews from the periphery and from other locations outside of Tel Aviv, where I live, and it's and I'm benefiting from a lot of privilege from living there. But I recognize that I'm the only one that speaks English in the way that I am from all of my family, from 12 brothers and sisters that my mom have, and 16 brothers and sisters that my father have, and their children. I'm the only one that is able to communicate that. So in a sense, this community of the largest group of Jews of color in the world, if you will, are without representation inside Israel and outside of Israel, and we've been deprived of even telling our story properly. And I think that's where we are, where we're at with this, with discrimination that still exists and almost unspoken about and a taboo in the Israeli society.
Mm. And to what degree would you say these issues that are forefront in the Mizrahi community are converging in any way with this larger protest movement, or is it not connected?
Well, I mean, there's no direct connection, but there is this this subcontext in the conversation about the protest that is coming from the right. As I said, it is politicization of the Mizrahi story and the cause, and saying that the protesters are just those Ashkenazi elitists from the left. Although we're seeing Mizrahim like myself and others that understand the importance of the Supreme Court, but in the conversation about the Supreme Court, the right is saying, well, we actually want to reform the Supreme Court because we want to allow more Mizrahi representation. As we all know, there was only one Mizrahi judge. There is only one Mizrahi judge in the Supreme Court in Israel today. But that's not because there is a need for. It's not because it's the reform that is suggested is not really to include Mizrahim, and we know that because this government has been in power for a long time before that, and they have not. There wasn't anything done to make sure that there's more Mizrahim represented in the government, but it's a way to sell it to their voters and making it a racial or ethnic issue that will rile the people up. But I think that there's no direct connection. I think there's a manufactured connection that has been, again, really cynical use of this group of people. That since Begin, that was really cared about us. I don't think about all Jewish people and wanted to see us as one people. I don't think there was a true leader in the Likud that really cared about this community and wanted to elevate them. So it's been used, but it's been used very cynically, and it's not a genuine issue for them.
Mm. Do either of you want to comment on that at all, Isabel or Yossi?
Well, it's so complex. So many families are now mixed Ashkenazi, Mizrahi. I think a third of children born in Israel today are born into families with parents from both sides. And I think Hen's right. It's the divisions are sharpened and made more acute by the political use or abuse, in a way, very often. And yes, there are real problems, and there is a periphery versus what's seen generally as the liberal, prosperous, white Ashkenazi center of the country. And there are gaps. There are economic gaps. There are gaps in academia that nobody has done enough to try and bridge. And Hen is absolutely right. But I think he's also right in that often it's the cynical use of the so-called ethnic demon that pops up every election time and whenever there is strife, which creates more of a division than perhaps is there in everyday life.
Mm. Isabel,
sorry, just to interject that, I think that the number, according to the recent report that I read, there's only 11% of the children in Israel are coming from mixed families, which was really surprising to me because I know, just like you, my friends are, most of them are in mixed relationship, but that was the last number that I've seen, which is, very surprising.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
Isabel, you did most of the reporting and, in fact, the writing for your book before, the current situation developed in Israel. But yet you were fairly prescient, right, in terms of, even the subtitle of your book. And you write that, this, as you describe various tribes and people and communities, this is the portrait of a country on the precipice, battling for its inner soul. So to what degree do you think, and again, Yossi's touched on this a little bit, I think we all understand now that what's going on now and what's being fought for goes beyond judicial reform, which might have been the catalyst for the demonstrations and the movement. But to what extent do you think this is kind of the battle that you are really describing in your book?
Well, it seems almost as if this judicial overhaul thing popped up 3 months ago from nowhere. And everybody was kind of shocked by the dizzying pace with which this government wanted to push ahead with it. But actually, yes, it's a result of a long process of a changing of the guard, generational change, demographic change. A change in the balance in Israel of the old elites giving way to, newer expressions of Israeliness. And to a large degree, you have, it's often said, the Israelis being split between those who identify more as Jews and those who are more Israelis. And, you have the Israelis with the more inclusive, liberal, universal values, and reflecting more of the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, if you will, with the very basic principle of equality, which has never been anchored in any law, specifically in Israel to this day. On the contrary, you had the nation-state law passed in 2018 that omitted any mention of democracy or equality, and only focused on Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. And then you have the Israelis who are more on the rise, who see more Israel as the Jewish state, and very much as Yossi was placing that question of what is the Jewish state? Well, it's different things to different people, but the people who put the Jewish above the Israeli are in government. And we're seeing the fringes, the most extreme fringes of Israeli society now in the government. And perhaps what we're seeing with this judicial overhaul is a kind of glimpse of the future of where this country may inevitably be going, or not, depending on how this battle ends up. But I do think that what we're seeing now is very much, you can't really understand it unless you go back to the roots of these divisions and to the long processes underway in Israeli society. And we're seeing those results now.
I actually, I don't see what's playing out on the streets today as Israeli versus Jewish. I see this instead as a deep argument over what we mean by Jewish, because the demonstrators, at least this is the feel that I get, are very comfortable in their Jewish identity, and a lot has changed in Israel in the last couple of decades. And this has a great deal to do with the Mizrahi influence on Israeli culture, which has really helped re-Judaize Israeli music, for example, and other cultural forms. And what the tragedy, in a way, that that I see about this moment is that the rise of a militantly of a militant religious fundamentalism joined together in a coalition with an extreme ultra-nationalist party is really reopening the possibility of alienation from Jewish identity, which was very much the case in Israel's early years. But one of the great healings that I felt in Israeli society over the last few decades was a certain convergence that we were becoming comfortable in our Jewish skins. And the challenge I feel for Israel today is to be able to keep the debate over what we mean by a Jewish state, not whether we want a Jewish state. Because if the debate goes in that direction, if we go back to being, militant secularists for whom Israeliness has very little, if anything, to do with Jewishness, versus ultra Jews, then we're really in an abyss. Then there's really no possible communication. But when I listen to Yair Lapid, for example, I hear a Jew. Benny Gantz is a Jew. They're not only speaking as Israelis. Both of them are synagogue goers. Benny Gantz goes to synagogue every Shabbat. Yair probably goes on holidays. He goes to a Reform synagogue in Tel Aviv. But compare him to his father, who wouldn't set foot in any synagogue. So I really do feel there's been a softening in the antagonism on the part of secular Israel toward religion. But again, my worry is that this government can reopen that chasm.
I would add, though, that, there is a fragility that we're seeing now to Israeli democracy that maybe we weren't so aware of even a year ago. And one measure of it is how the country treats the Israelis who are not Jewish. So we have a minority of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel who make up a fifth of the population here. We have at least 400,000, if not more, immigrants from the former Soviet Union and elsewhere who are not technically, halachically Jewish, can't get married actually in Israel officially. And how is the state dealing with that? So, yes, I agree. There's not a contradiction between being Israeli or Israeliness and Jewishness in many, many instances. But there's always that question of, measuring Israeli democracy by how it's treating those who are actually not Jewish or halachically Jewish.
Yeah.
And of course, it goes also to LGBTQ couples and same-sex couples that want to marry, although they are
absolutely.
So,
and many halachically Jewish Israelis who don't want to get married through the ultra-Orthodox Rabbanut, the rabbinical authorities. It goes on and on.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from the audience. The protesters and Yossi had warned against mixing the Palestinian issue, I want to get to that a little bit, into the judicial overhaul issue. But this questioner asks, when fighting for democracy, how can Israel not also grapple with its control over the Palestinian people with no end in sight? Have the protesters changed in their attitude in that way? Yossi, have you seen a change in the protest movement regarding this?
No, I haven't, and I think for good reason. And I uphold the intuition of the protest movement to separate the two, even though I understand the question. But when you have a heart attack, a massive heart attack, you don't deal primarily with the cancer if you have cancer at the same time. And I don't really like those health analogies, but the Palestinian tragedy is festering. It's long term, and it's not going to be solved anytime soon. Even if the protest movement were to turn in the direction of the occupation, on the other hand, we're facing an emergency. If we lose an independent court, if the independence of the court is whittled away to the point where we begin to resemble autocratic countries, then then it's over. It's over in the sense of whatever we would try to accomplish on the Palestinian front would be irrelevant, because this country will be completely transformed. And so there's a pragmatic, first of all, a pragmatic answer. And sometimes I feel on the left this need to be right, and not to, and as we used to say in Israel, don't be right, be smart. And I feel that the dogmatic left much prefers to be right rather than smart. And the result is that there's virtually no left in the state of Israel. The left has been so marginalized because they're always right. They always need to be right. And we're in a very complicated situation in Israel. And much of the left prefers to ignore those complexities and instead insist on a certain ideological purity. And this is a perfect example. We're fighting for the survival of the courts, and we're hearing voices from the left or the far left saying, well, why aren't you protesting for the occupation? But there's also not only a pragmatic reason here, Lisa, there is truthfully a substantive reason as well. And that is that the reading of most Israelis, and I certainly include most of the Israelis on the streets on a weekly basis, our reading about why there is no peace and what the chances are for peace is very different than a Jewish left-wing reading. In the Jewish left-wing narrative, Israel is primarily, if not exclusively, responsible for the absence of peace. That is not at all how most Israeli Jews understand this, and certainly not how most centrist Israelis, which is the camp I come from, and which is mostly the camp that's demonstrating on the streets, come from. And in our understanding, the Palestinian tragedy is at least as much the fault of the Palestinian national movement, which has always said no to every offer going back to the 1930s. And that doesn't absolve Israel from our responsibility. We shouldn't be expanding settlements, certainly not outside the settlement blocks. We should be putting an offer for peace on the table every year and let the Palestinian leadership continue to say no. But we have the responsibility as the power to continuously put a credible peace proposal on the table. But having said that, do I really believe that if the far left were in power in Israel, would we really have peace with the Palestinian leadership? Listen to Mahmoud Abbas's speech in the UN last week. There is no possibility at this moment for the most minimal meeting point. And I say this with tremendous pain because I desperately want a two-state solution. It's not possible now. And so to be demonstrating for something which unfortunately at this point is theoretical, and to divert our singular focus on preventing the destruction of Israel's independent judiciary seems to me a classical left-wing self-defeating position.
I don't know if either of the other two have any comment on that, but I do, Isabel, it was probably inevitable that a question would come up from the audience about the New York Times. So I'm sure you're prepared for that. But look, you've lived in Israel, you've chronicled Israel, but you've also raised your family there. But I guess it's almost kind of an axiom that correspondents covering Israel get backlash from all sides. You're too pro-Israel, too pro-Palestinian. The paper is, one way or the other. How do you respond to those complaints?
Well, look, there's the old cliche that if everybody's complaining from both sides, you must be doing something right. But I don't subscribe to that. Maybe I'm doing everything wrong. To be honest, there is legitimate criticism from both sides that I do try and take on board when it's constructive and makes a good point. And I'm not somebody that just rejects out of hand all criticism from whichever side it's coming. But at the same time, we're never going to cover this region to the satisfaction of the advocates on either side. And so many of our readers are passionate on one side or the other. And, you know, journalism it's a profession, it's a craft, and there are rules, and independent journalism is never going to satisfy either of those narratives of the advocates, and shouldn't. So on the one hand, I try and take on board, as I say, the constructive criticism, and at the same time have to just block out a lot of noise. And at the end of the day, just try and do the job, and be intellectually honest with myself as far as I can be, and just try to be fair.
Okay.
And if I can just add, because I think sometimes I see it from point to defend you, Isabel, in this, because I often see advocates from our side, people that I know that I'm friendly with, that would post things like, you know, oh, the New York Times said murdered instead of slaughtered, and it's just, you know, that's I have to say, like, sometimes yes, there are mistakes, but it's far too often that you're taking hits for things that are just not justified. And I understand where it comes from. It's emotional. It's emotional for me as well, and we all get angry. But yeah, I think generally speaking, it's pretty balanced.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there have been Times headlines, and I know that the reporters are not responsible for the headlines, that will say, you know, two Israelis killed, without mentioning, you know, Palestinian terrorists killing Israelis. When Palestinians are killed by Israeli soldiers, that's almost always in the headlines. And so it's not only an exaggerated sensitivity. I think that there is a tendency in the journalistic community, in parts of the journalistic community, to give the Palestinians a pass because they're the victims, and to indulge the Palestinians in their victimhood, which really, I think, in some ways, only reinforces the problem and makes it so much more difficult for the Palestinian leadership to play the role of peacemaker rather than the perpetual victim.
Mm-hmm.
Look, there are occasions, I would just say, when people might interpret a headline like that as being giving the Palestinians a pass, when in fact the assailants haven't been identified yet. Nobody can tell you actually who they are or where they're from. And our job is to just be careful and accurate. So, there might be times where there's a misworded headline that doesn't give you the whole story in the way it should. And there are other times where it's a work in progress. And later on in the day, when the assailants have been identified, that would be reflected in the headline. But often it can be misinterpreted, and I accept that.
Okay. And I actually want to continue this in a different way, this point, because you're kind of in the world that a lot of us aren't necessarily, in social media, and really dealing with Israel and anti-Semitism and the kind of issues that the protests, kind of all wrapped up into, one. What is happening in kind of that social media world that, in terms of Israel's, its reputation, the kind of the response that you feel compelled to give and are training people to give?
Yeah, it's a whole new world out there, and just the fact that I've used social media for a long time and been involved in it gave me the tools to start a Tel Aviv Institute, where we train other Jewish influencers to speak up on social media about their Jewish identity and against anti-Semitism. I agree with Yossi. There's very often misleading headlines, not only from the New York Times, from other places as well. And I just feel like we are, as Jewish community that are Zionists, that cares about Israel, we often are getting, again, for me, it's emotional. So that's how I describe it. And every time Israel is taking a hit or Jews are taking a hit online, it's very personal for me. And I know that that it is like that for a lot of us, but we just have to be in the age of social media, we have to be more strategic on the way that we're talking about things. So if a couple of decades ago, we did not want to have any criticism of Israel on social media. Today, it's actually very effective, according to our data, to speak about the challenges in Israel. It's actually humanizing Israel to speak about the protests and to show that Israelis are standing up for social justice. We found that when we're showing LGBTQ in Israel and gay pride in Israel, it actually make people change their mind, not speaking about it as just this utopia that everything is perfect, but speaking about the challenges those minority communities are facing and showing that as well. And we're doing it on social media, on Instagram, on TikTok. I'm probably too old for TikTok, but I'm still there. And we're trying to make an impact and a change, and we're reaching. It's amazing. Those social media influencers, each one of them has millions of followers, and they can reach so many people. And if they know, and if they have the right tools to do that, we're working with a chef, and we're working with a stylist, and we're working with a model, and their followers are not Jewish by and large. And when we help them speak about their Jewish identity and, in a sense, come out as Jewish, then they're disproving all of the misinformation that is out there. And we know that the two communities that are most targeted on social media are Jews and gay people. And being in the intersection of both, I can tell you it's not fun. But there's a way to change it. And we know that the way to change anti-Semitism and prejudice against Jews is by showing the true Jewish identity and what being Jewish is, and humanizing the Jewish community, the Jewish people, in the face of a dehumanization campaign.
A question that I think is important for our audience is the role of diaspora Jews, particularly American Jews, playing into this whole debate and what's going on right now, the democracy question in Israel. Yossi, I think you have some thoughts about that.
Well, I think that we in Israel have played a duplicitous game in the messaging that we send to diaspora Jews. If you support my camp, you're not interfering in Israel's internal affairs. You're strengthening Israel, because that's what my camp is trying to do. But if you support the other camp, how dare you? How dare you meddle in Israel's internal affairs when we're the ones who will pay the price for Israel's policies and diaspora Jews won't? So I think we need to re-examine some first principles here in the Israeli-American Jewish relationship, and begin by saying, if Israel is the project of the whole Jewish people, which is what we've claimed, what Zionism has claimed from the very beginning, justifiably, I believe, then that means that Israel not only has privileges, not only it should be the recipient of diaspora support, but we also have some responsibilities to listen to diaspora Jews, not necessarily to agree, but certainly there should be a place at the table where diaspora concerns can be heard, a real place, not a symbolic place, which is what we have today. And I don't know what that would look like, but I feel this is a moment where we really need a reset in the diaspora-Israel relationship, and that it's an opportunity for a reset. Because, on security issues, I understand those Israelis who say, yes, we're the ones who pay the price. It's our kids who pay the price, and we have to have the last word. And that's, to my mind, that's a given. But in issues that affect Israel's identity, will Israel continue to be a credible democratic state? What kind of a Jewish state will we be? Inclusive or narrow? These are issues that impact directly on the diaspora. If, God forbid, we lose our democracy, how will American society look at American Jews? How will Americans look at the two flags on the bima of most American synagogues? If Israel isn't a democracy, do you keep the Israeli flag on the bima? These are questions that go to the heart of contemporary American Jewish identity. And so you have a stake in these issues. And I've been encouraging American Jews to speak up. And I realize that if I have to be honest to my own principles, I have to accept the right of American Jews who support the government and support the judicial revolution to likewise intervene in Israeli internal affairs. And so, yes, I am urging American Jews of whatever your politics are, study the issues. This is not only my problem as an Israeli. This is a problem of the Jewish people. What kind of Israel are we going to be, and how will we project Israel into the world?
And if I can just add to this, because this was brilliant, but also the important thing, and that's what happened in May 2021. We saw that what happens in Israel affected Jewish communities and the diaspora. So, and it's not the fault of any party, but the fault of anti-Semites. But we saw Jews being attacked in the streets abroad. So I definitely think that, I mean, just agreeing with Yossi and adding this to it, that diaspora Jews should have a place at the table to contribute to this conversation.
I want to end with an optimistic note, if possible. I want to ask each of you, what is your greatest hope for Israel over the next 75 years? Isabel, why don't you start?
Well, I think one of my greatest hopes is that something that's now being debated should not happen. You might be surprised to hear that the rise of these acute divisions in Israeli society have actually led to a debate here about whether it might not be better to just split and cantonize the country. And, so my hope would be that the Israelis can find enough of a common camp and a common future to continue to build upon, so that in 75 years, it will still be a whole recognizable country which can continue to thrive.
My biggest hope is to just have peace and genuine peace throughout the Middle East for every country. My hope is that I'll be able to go visit where my grandparents are from in Iraq and Tunisia without being afraid. We saw just last week in Tunisia an anti-Semitic terror attack, which was a reminder that it's still not fully safe for us. But if I think that would be my biggest hope, is that we would be able to cross borders in the Middle East without fearing for our lives.
So I think that listening to both Isabel and Hen, the conclusion that I have is that Israel's greatest challenge and greatest opportunity is to turn conflict, whether internal or external, into an opportunity for rethinking human relationships. And look, I'm a religious Jew, and I come at this really from a place of faith. I believe we were brought back to this land for a purpose, and for me, the purpose is to try to take the disparate pieces of ourselves. We were separated from each other for 2,000 years, and we really didn't know each other for 2,000 years. And to try to put ourselves back together as an organic people is a process that no nation has ever undertaken before. It's extraordinary. And at the same time, to be the only non-Arab, non-Muslim state for thousands of kilometers around us in one of the most difficult regions of the world. Each of those, whether the internal or the external, would be monumental historic challenges. And we have to do those two challenges together. And so my hope, my prayer for Israel in the next 75 years is that we really embrace our very difficult reality as the purpose for our coming home, and not to see all of the difficulties and challenges that we face in terms of our difficult relationships, again, whether internal or external, as sources of despair, but really as the opportunity to get this right. And if we do get this right, then I think we're going to in some ways, retroactively vindicate 4,000 years of the Jewish story.